Well, I hope the title hasn't turned too many people off. I had second thoughts about that, but thank you to the organisers and thank you to everyone for coming and making the effort to coming along to this session. I would like to take you outside the flags, to the area that perhaps we're not so familiar with being in. That's a pretty complex overview, but the first half of this talk is a qualitative appeal to the intuitions of the values of knowledge. We're going to run through about how I know it has value and looking at how it's developed and refined. Culture and spirituality were traditionally the repositories of knowledge that we had as a society. And not all knowledge has equal value, and it depends on context and a few other things. And we're going to talk a little bit about agricultural societies and use that as an example of how the knowledge matters. The second half, or hopefully the better part of this talk, is actually a little bit more robust in terms of quantitative discussion. And I'll start with the apocryphal story of Ian Turing, and we'll talk about the measurement of knowledge. And we are well and truly outside the flags now, and if you can't swim, we may well find ourselves out the back pretty quick smart. Culture and spirituality as a repository of knowledge. See, in the old days, we had about 45 annual cycles to get it done. Survive, find some food, find a mate, raise a family. And communities were the place where the continuum of interwoven lifespans allowed a culture to develop good ideas. Over 250,000 years, it's not overnight, it takes a long time. Evolutionary judgment was quite harsh, and the usefulness of any set of knowledge, it'll be patchy, but it had to be reasonably useful, otherwise you became extinct. You'd consider it to be a collective knowledge rather than individual pockets of excellence, and it provided a structure for appropriate action. So when you got up in the morning, you had a pretty good idea where to find the monkeys in the tree. It may not tell you how to catch that one that day, but it gave you a pretty good idea where to start. Informed models or hypotheses about the world were based on the memories of generations which would be accrued together. And on average, this set of knowledge and culture was developed, on average, had value. I'd like to use a sandpit example of the lion model. It's the lion danger model. So, you have a fixed amount of time and you have a fixed amount of ability to take in data and analyse that data. Now, if you are lucky enough to be born into a society which has an extensive knowledge of lions, you will know that they're dangerous and you'll commit time and effort to either avoiding or defeating that lion rather than coming to some conclusion. If you have never seen a large mammal, let alone a large cat, some of that time, the data and time knowledge and the patterns you'll be looking for will be towards resolving whether lions are dangerous or not. And then if you're lucky, you'll have time to figure out what to do. Unfortunately, if you think they're warm and cuddly to begin with, it will take you some time to reverse the belief that they're warm and cuddly and you probably will die. Information is a finite resource and it's apportioned between the structure or the discrimination between models and the parameters which calibrate those models, but it's finite. So culture and spirituality as a repository of knowledge, it was a successful collective of knowledge, and it was quite durable over the centuries. But if you're an Inuit and you were more concerned about cold climates and fish, seals and so forth, many of those skills are not translatable down to the grasslands or to the forests. There were different skill sets that were appropriate and different knowledge. Contextually, knowledge has value, but out of context, the value rapidly disappears and it wouldn't be said to be the same. So I started to write a list and I started to put some pictures of all the areas that we have seen this evolutionary process of knowledge occur. And it got to be a big list and I had no room for extra pictures, but it ranges from hunting and gathering and food preparation, families, the way that you structure your society, shelter and clothing, material technology. And over the world it's going to be patchy. There'll be areas of excellence and areas of not so excellence. But cultural knowledge provides you a head start. You don't have to do the Groundhog Day every day and figure out whether lions are bad, because you can wake up in the morning and you can know that. And when you're out and you see one, you can act reasonably quickly and appropriately because you have good priors and a good knowledge of what might happen. And there's no need to expend resources that you don't need to. We know that it's actually quite beneficial to copy good ideas as long as they're good ideas, and social learning will tell us the most successful agents are those in a context that's stable that adopt things that work. rather than trying to figure it out themselves. However, in new situations or in places that are rapidly changing, the risks involved with knowledge discovery de novo are justified. Exploratory learning is flexible and adaptable, but has high risk. There's a high chance of error, but you may well succeed. So if we were to look at, say, ancient Egypt, and you'd be wondering why we're talking about this at an ANZICS conference, the culture and belief structure in ancient Egypt is to some extent related to the annual cycles of inundation, or was thousands of years ago. It's why the society was stable and successful over a long period. That every year the priests could see Sirius rise in the dawn sky, and this happens only at a certain time of the year. And that was the time that preceded the inundation that brought the floods, the water, and brought the fertile silt. So after you saw this procession of stars in the dawn, you knew, or at least the priests and the pharaoh knew, that things were about to start to kick off. Because there's a statistical behaviour that they would not deterministically been aware of the floods in the Upper Nile reaches, which would take a long time to traverse 6,000 kilometres. But these were reliable and reasonably predictable. And there was a god who was related to the inundation, and they were very reliable, happened all the time. It made perfect sense, just as much as Thor, the thunder god, makes sense in trying to understand weather. They didn't have the thermodynamic ability to understand some of the more difficult stuff, but this was a pretty sophisticated structure. They could also figure out how much silt with this nilometer, which is down in the bottom left-hand corner, where they could see the turbidity of the water, and they could have a look at the rate of rise and have ideas about what was about to happen. And what was invoked in this and many other places is this belief in spirituality, when you couldn't really observe what the model was all about and how it was working. And it's founded to some extent in belief and trust. But if we were to look at other situations where there is a large river that floods from time to time and people farm on it, and that little map tries to show you where they are, some of the knowledge that you would have had as the priest of Hapi wouldn't have worked so well. So the floods that occur around the Tigris and Euphrates don't happen at the end of summer. They happen at the end of winter, when the snow comes out of Turkey and it runs down, and it does the same sort of thing. It's not quite as reliable, but there are ways of predicting, and different constellations, different people, and there's a completely different structure of beliefs around this. So many things could be known. If you were the farmer, then probably you'd still farm and you'd do what you were told. There wouldn't be that much difference in growing the grain and stuff. But once you started to get up to the high level knowledge, this was actually quite important differences. They weren't necessarily wrong, but contextually they weren't appropriate. I'd like to move about 50,000 years or 3,000 years forward, and we'll talk about the information age. And I'm going to define that on reflection as being the time when we measured information. Not the deluge of information, but once we start to measure information, I think that's a reasonable place to start. And I'll use the Ian Turing apocryphal story because many of us are familiar with it from popular culture. It'll save me a lot of time. I'd like to focus on the work that he did in Cambridge to begin with. So in Cambridge, he devised the Turing machine, which was a binary machine that could solve any problem, theoretically, that could be solved algorithmically. It was a forerunner of a computer before we had computers. He figured out that it's not always possible to determine whether a program or a problem could be solved, sometimes until it was solved. So you could go for long periods of time and perhaps go forever and not solve it. And this is really important to understand the context that he walked into Bletchley Park some 5 years later to do the Enigma codes. So this is Groundhog Day. Every single day the code changes. The trick and the genius that Turing had was to walk in there and go, I don't know whether we can solve this, but what we will do is we will measure our accrual of information, which is evidential information that changes our belief in the nature of the code. We know we have a fixed amount of resources. There are a certain number of people, there's a certain amount of work we can do on our calculation machines, a certain amount of time. At 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, it's all going to change. So they stole a bit of stuff, they had a copy of the Enigma machine, they used the Banbury sheets, which are those things in the top left-hand corner, to look for repeats. They even knew the way that individual people typed the Morse code when they had to code it out, that individual people had certain ways that they typed and phrases that they used. And with that in mind, over a period of several months, they were able to start to inch towards getting a solution. And one day they solved it before 8 o'clock in the morning. And that showed them that that was the way forward. Now, there were times that they put an extra rotor on the machine and it all fell apart in 1940-something. So it wasn't smooth sailing. But his genius was to use the BAN, which was a log 10 measurement of the odds by which the new pieces of information changed how sure you could be that you were close to the answer. So he wasn't the first and he's not the last, but he's kind of in the middle. So Fisher is a great statistician. He didn't like Bayes' theorem, but he developed a way of measuring information, which we still use. Hartley came along and said, well, let's look at the number of ways this data could be represented, the number of recognisable states. We'll take the log of it in base 10, and that he called a heart, or has been subsequently called a heart, but he was trying to measure the amount of information that he had in a data set. Turing came along, having done the work he'd done at Cambridge, plus having read what other people had done, and was able to achieve with his team what he achieved in that period. And incidentally, it was only declassified in 1973. This is a big deal, because in 1973, the Soviets stopped using the Lorenz code, which they were requiring still his techniques to solve and sort the Lorenz code up until 1973. So Shannon is another very intelligent guy who lobs into the scene, an engineer and mathematician who was accredited with making the most influential master's thesis of the 20th century by showing that the Boolean logic that we take for granted now that computers use in general could in fact be done by computer circuits. That was before transistors. Just like Turing's work was before computers existed, he was able to do this before there were widespread use of transistors. So these are valve computers in these days. He went on to be more interested in the encoding of information rather than the decoding of information, the loss of information, the way you could compress it, the way that you could share it and analyse it. And he published, after it was declassified in 1949, this once again was a state secret. Up until it was published widely in 1949, it was in Scientific American in the early 50s. And this was a mature theory that came out. This was not just a first idea. This was one of those surprising mature theories. People forget that they were working on it for 10 years. And he met Turing in 1943, so they had discussed some of these issues. And he had met other luminaries at Princeton during that time. And it was declassified. It was based very much on Boltzmann's thermodynamics. The mathematics looks very similar. At the same time, Kullback and Liebler were looking at the way that the data will change your beliefs, and the way that if you understand something, how much extra data do you need to describe the truth, or at least another situation. And they popularised an information measure which showed the difference between two distributions generally. This was declassified in 1951 before it was published. It was kept secret until then. It was such a big deal. Meanwhile, Kolmogorov, who is one of the grandfather or godfathers of probability in Russia, and Chaitin in the US, were working on measuring the complexity of strings of numbers and descriptions of data sets. The thing about all of these people is they're measuring the same thing in different ways, and the numbers are much the same, but often in different bases. How important is this? Many of these were classified military secrets, but they're not now. They're freely available. And often we declassify technology when it's commercially required, or it becomes widely available and there's no sense in keeping it a secret. And you know about the GPS story, how GPS is till 2000 were several metres of accuracy, and then they suddenly dropped to 1 metre. They're probably of the order of millimetres to centimetres in military-grade GPSs at the moment. Pixel size, you can't legally sell a satellite photo with a pixel size under 30 centimetres. But there's no doubt that you can get pixel sizes of smaller than that, particularly when you use other information from photographs that already exist. And if data is the new oil, and you've all heard that, I'm sure, then analysis and the storage of data and knowing what's right is the new arms race. So regarding information measures, what am I claiming it actually is? It lies in the number of data elements and their relationships, and you can measure this. It can be quite difficult, and it can be hard to actually limit the measures, but it can be measured theoretically. And it represents, to some extent, the evidence of structures within that data and the disposition of data elements within those structures. So Shannon's entropy, which is a commonly used, but there are many other choices, give you log 2 or minus log 2 of the number of digits needed to encode a system or a data set or a message. It is a combinatorial measure, very similar to Boltzmann's thermodynamic description. In general, highly ordered systems have low entropy and disordered systems have high entropy. It allows us to place information values which we use for decisions under uncertainty and choices about model design, models themselves, priors, experimental design, and your choices of how you collect data in those experiments and the strength of the evidence that's supporting beliefs when you're reading papers. It allows us to put some metric around that. It is related to, but is not the same as probability. And this is the only time I'm using the word probability in a discussion about research and knowledge. There's lots of ways that we do measure it. They measure the same thing, but they are used in different contexts and what it is you're trying to measure with respect to the information that you're bringing to bear. And information is a bit like fuel. And in The Economist a couple of months ago, that was the front page, the new oil. So information has value. It has utility. You could base it on a cost to acquire it, or you could base it on the value that you get when you bring to bear on knowledge discovery. It can be quantitatively measured, or at least estimated, and it can be tracked. And this is the most powerful thing, is you can track the movement of information through hypotheses, ideas, discussions, papers, meta-analyses. Information that comes from outside your data set is typically in the introduction. You can introduce biases by only selecting chunks of evidence that you want to talk about, or it's in the end of your paper where you start to put it in context and discuss the meaning of what your study is. You can't use it twice, but many of us do, and it can reduce the power of our findings. And information that comes from within your data set informs the choice of a prior, or perhaps designs the hypothesis, or perhaps you've designed that and from that comes the information. Or even to do a statistical test, revise a prior to a posterior. Or you portion it out between the structure and complexity of your model and the parameters that you use to calibrate that model. But you can only legitimately use it once. The really cool thing about evidence and information is that when you look at what evidence really is, it's that information that contributes to the truth values of your model. This is pretty special because you can start to measure that. And if you can figure it out, it is incredibly powerful. You can't usually just get it from reading a paper, but if you look at the data that people are using and you figure out how they're using it, this is very powerful. So follow the information trail. When you make decisions, when you interpret research, when you plan research, and when you take a deep breath and jump into the pool of big data, data structures and algorithmic analysis. As Peter said, it was almost a generation ago that I did some machine learning and sequential statistics for a PhD, and I left that really disillusioned because p-values were not the answer. The answer is somewhere about understanding where the evidence for what you're trying to say comes from and whether it's legitimate. So, I'll leave you with this. Data is a resource. Information is the asset that comes from that resource. And knowledge is the value that you can place on all of it. Thank you.